When Paul Walker walks into a small family restaurant after a long day of filming, wearing worn-out work clothes and looking exhausted, the arrogant waitress immediately assumes he's just another broke customer who can't afford to tip and treats him with open contempt, making snide remarks loud enough for the other customers to hear. But what happens when an ordinary customer realizes who he really is and reveals the truth about his character will leave everyone in the restaurant absolutely stunned and teach one woman a powerful lesson about judging others. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows of Mel's Diner, a small family-run diner tucked away on a quiet street in Santa Monica. The kind of place where the coffee was always fresh, the pie was homemade, and the atmosphere was like stepping back in time. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, a classic jukebox hummed softly in the corner, and the smell of bacon and fresh bread filled the air. This wasn't a place for tourists or Instagram photos. It was where locals came for comfort food, honest prices, and the feeling that someone actually cared about their satisfaction. The lunch rush had died down, leaving just a few customers scattered around the dining room. An elderly couple sharing a slice of apple pie, a construction worker reading his newspaper over a cup of coffee, and a young mother trying to keep her toddler entertained with crayons. Behind the counter, Michelle Torres wiped down already clean surfaces with quick, efficient movements. At 28, Michelle had been working at Mel's for 3 years and already had strong opinions about the type of customers who walked through the door. She could spot the high tippers on the other side of the counter, the executives who placed quick orders and left generous tips, the well-dressed families who appreciated good service. And she could spot the problem customers just as easily, the ones who studied the menu for 20 minutes before ordering something cheap. The ones who asked for extra portions of everything but never seemed to have money for a decent tip. The ones who looked like they belonged at a fast food drive-thru instead of a traditional restaurant. Michelle prided herself on her efficiency, her ability to turn things around quickly and maximize her profits. She wasn't rude to anyone, but she definitely prioritized certain clients over others. Time was money, and some people were clearly worth more than others. The doorbell rang. As someone entered and Michelle looked up from her cleaning, a tall man in his late 40s entered, moving slowly as if each step required effort. He wore faded work pants covered in dust and what looked like paint stains, a gray t-shirt that had seen better days, and worn, scuffed boots. His hair was disheveled, stubble covered his jaw, and there were bags under his eyes. He looked like he'd just finished a 12-hour shift at a construction site or a machine shop. Michelle's expert assessment kicked in immediately. Blue-collar worker, probably paid daily, able to order cheap and drink a single cup of coffee for an hour. Her least favorite type of customer. Paul Walker stood in the doorway, taking in the cozy atmosphere of the restaurant. He had been filming for 14 hours straight, doing his own stunts for a sequence that required take after take to get right. Every muscle in his body ached. His clothes were dusty from rolling around on the concrete, and all he wanted was a quiet meal, and maybe 30 minutes without anyone needing anything from him. He had chosen this place specifically because it seemed unpretentious, the kind of place where he could blend in and be just another customer. No cameras, no autograph requests, no pressure to be on, just a tired guy looking for good food and a moment of peace. Paul approached the receptionist's desk, but Michelle was already there, menu in hand. Her smile was polite but distant, the kind of professional courtesy that didn't reach his eyes. "Just one?" she asked, already scanning the dining room for the least desirable table. "Yes, please," Paul replied, his voice low and respectful. Michelle led him to a small table near the kitchen door, the kind of place where the noise of the dishwasher and the cooking of food would make conversation difficult. And the view was mostly of the emergency exit. It wasn't the worst table in the restaurant, but it certainly wasn't the best. Paul slid into the booth without complaint, grateful for the mere fact of being seated. He accepted the menu with a sincere smile and a quiet, "Thank you," and immediately focused on the options, visibly hungry. Michelle was standing by the table, pen and notepad in hand, her posture suggesting she was already eager to move on to more important tasks. "What would you like to drink?" Paul looked up from the menu. "Coffee would be great. Black, please." She scribbled without much enthusiasm. Of course it was just coffee. Probably one shot after another as he sat there for 2 hours. "I'll give you a few minutes to look at the menu," she said, already turning away. "Actually," Paul said gently, "I think I'm ready to ask, if that's okay." Michelle turned, pen in hand, clearly expecting it to be quick. Paul closed the menu and looked at her with tired but kind eyes. "Can I get the meatloaf special with mashed potatoes and green beans? And maybe a slice of that apple pie I saw when I came in?" Michelle blinked in surprise. The meatloaf special was one of the more expensive entrees, and adding pie brought the total to a respectable amount. Maybe she'd miscalculated, but probably not by much. He still looked like someone who would count out exact change and leave, quarters as a tip. "Sure," she replied, taking notes. "How do you want this meatloaf prepared?" "Whatever. The cook recommends it," Paul said with a slight smile. "I hope you know what you're doing." The response was so genuinely pleasant that Michelle almost smiled back. Almost. Instead, she nodded professionally and headed for the kitchen, already mentally calculating how long she would need to spend checking on him and how much attention she should give to the customers who might actually earn her rent. At the coffee shop, Michelle poured Paul's coffee into a slightly chipped mug. Not the worst they had, but certainly not the fine china they used for important-looking clients. She carried it back to his table, set it down unceremoniously, and was about to leave when Paul looked up from his phone. "Thank you," he said. And there was something in his voice, genuine gratitude for such a small gesture, that made Michelle pause for a moment. "The food will be here in about 15 minutes, she said, her tone a little softer despite herself. Paul nodded and took a sip of coffee, closing his eyes briefly, as if this first taste was exactly what he needed. Perfect, no rush. As he walked away, Michelle found herself staring at him. There was something different about the way he carried himself, even as exhausted as he was. Most of his clients, who looked like blue-collar workers, had a hard, defensive attitude that came from judgment. But this guy seemed at ease, like he was genuinely grateful to be sitting at this table, drinking this coffee, waiting for this meal. Still, Michelle reminded herself as she poured coffee for the businessman at the counter that being polite didn't necessarily mean tipping well. She had learned that lesson the hard way over the years. The elderly couple at the corner table waved at her, and Michelle hurried to serve them. They were regulars, the kind of customers who came in twice a week, always ordered the same thing, and always left with exactly 20% off. She chatted with them warmly, filled them with coffee without being asked, and made sure they felt valued. Across the restaurant, Paul watched the interaction with quiet interest. He noticed a difference in Michelle's demeanor when she was with customers he considered worthy of her time. Her smile was brighter, her posture more engaged, her attention more focused. He didn't take it personally. He'd spent enough time in the service industry himself to understand the economics of waitressing. People needed to prioritize their energy where it would be rewarded. When Michelle brought out his special meatloaf, 20 minutes later, Paul was impressed with both the portion size and the presentation. It looked homemade and delicious, exactly the kind of comfort food he was craving. "It looks amazing," he said, as Michelle placed the plate on the table. "Thank you." Michelle felt the same slight surprise again. Most customers barely noticed the food delivery, but this guy seemed genuinely grateful. "Can I get you anything else? More coffee?" "Actually, yes, please. And could you thank the cook for me? It smells amazing." Michelle nodded, filling his coffee cup from the pot she was carrying. "I'll let him know." When she returned to the kitchen, she realized she had spent more time at the table than she had planned. There was something about his quiet gratitude. That made her want to do a good job, even if there was no financial incentive. Paul ate slowly, savoring every bite. The meatloaf was perfectly seasoned, the mashed potatoes were clearly made from scratch, and the green beans were still just the right amount of crunchy. It was exactly the kind of meal he had eaten as a child, the kind of food that made you feel loved. Halfway through the meal, the doorbell rang again, and a well-dressed woman in her 50s walked in. Michelle immediately straightened, her professional smile returning to full brightness. The woman clearly had money: designer handbag, impeccably styled hair, clothes that probably cost more than Michelle made in a week. "Good afternoon," Michelle said warmly, approaching with a menu. "Table for one?" "Yes, please," the woman replied, scanning the dining room. "Somewhere quiet, if possible." Michelle led her to one of the best tables in the restaurant, near the window overlooking the street and away from the noise of the kitchen. As they passed Paul's table, the woman looked at her and did a double take, slowing her pace a little. She stared at Paul for a moment, her expression changing from casual curiosity to recognition, and then to something close to shock. Paul was focused on his meal and didn't notice, but the woman continued to watch him as Michelle seated her at the table by the window. "Is everything okay?" Michelle asked, noticing the woman's distraction. The woman, whose name was Patricia Henderson, sat back in her chair but continued to stare at Paul's desk. "Yeah, do you know who that is?" Michelle followed his gaze to Paul, who was cutting into another piece of meatloaf, completely oblivious to the attention. "Just a customer. He ordered the meatloaf special." Patricia looked at Michelle with a mixture of amusement and disbelief. "It's Paul Walker." Michelle frowned. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't immediately place it. "Should I know who it is?" Patricia raised her eyebrows. "He's an actor. From the Fast and the Furious movies? Varsity Blues? He's pretty famous?" Michelle looked at Paul, trying to reconcile the tired, dusty man eating meatloaf with the idea of a famous actor. "Are you sure? He doesn't look—" She stopped talking, realizing how that sounded. Patricia caught the hint and her expression became more serious. "What does he not look like exactly?" Michelle felt her face flush. "I just mean, he's dressed like he works construction or something, and he's eating alone in a regular restaurant. Don't famous people go to fancy restaurants with entourages and stuff?" Patricia studied Michelle for a moment, then looked at Paul with something that seemed like affection. "That's exactly the point. He's probably one of the most down-to-earth celebrities I've ever met. I've met him several times at charity events." She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a lecture-like tone. "Did you know he donates most of his salary from these films to his stunt teams and crew members? He's been known to buy cars for people who help him on set, pay medical bills for strangers, and donate millions to children's charities without any publicity." Michelle felt something uncomfortable stirring in her stomach. "Really?" Patricia nodded. "Last year, he heard about a family whose house burned down and quietly paid for them to rebuild it. No cameras, no press releases. They didn't find out it was him until months later when someone saw the paperwork." As Patricia spoke, Michelle's attention drifted to Paul, who was now eating his apple pie with the same quiet appreciation he had shown for the rest of the meal. He looked exactly as she had imagined, a working man enjoying a simple meal after a long day. The idea that he might be secretly rich and famous seemed impossible. "I could be wrong," Michelle said uncertainly. "I mean, wouldn't I recognize him if he were really famous?" Patricia smiled gently. "Fame doesn't always look like what we expect, and the best people usually don't advertise it." She gestured toward Paul's table. "Look at how he's eating that pie. Does he look arrogant or picky? He looks like someone who really appreciates good food and simple kindness." Michelle watched as Paul finished the last of the pie and leaned back against her desk with a satisfied expression. He caught her looking at him and gave her a small nod and a grateful smile, the same kind of acknowledgement he had been showing her all evening. "Was he rude to you?" Patricia asked. "Demanding? Complaining about something?" Michelle shook her head slowly. "No, actually he's been very polite. He thanked me for everything, asked me to thank the cook." "And how exactly have you been treating him?" The question hit Michelle like a slap. She realized that while she hadn't been outright rude, to Paul, she certainly hadn't treated him the same way she had treated Patricia or the elderly couple. She'd sat him at the worst table, used his chipped coffee mug, and checked on him only when necessary. She judged him based on his appearance, and treated him accordingly while he was only kind and respectful in return. "My God," Michelle whispered, feeling the full weight of her assumptions. "I've been treating him like a second-class customer this whole time." Patricia's expression softened, with understanding instead of judgment. "It's not too late to change that." Michelle glanced at Paul, who was now taking out his wallet to pay the bill. In a few minutes, he would be gone, and she would have missed the opportunity to provide good service to someone who deserved it, not because of his fame or wealth, but because of his character. "Excuse me," she said to Patricia, standing up quickly. "I need to talk to him." As Michelle approached Paul's table, her heart was beating faster than usual. She didn't know what to say, but she knew she had to say something. Paul looked up as she approached, the same gentle expression on his face. "Is everything okay?" Michelle stood by the table for a moment, trying to find the right words. Finally, she settled on the truth. "I owe you an apology," she said calmly. Paul's eyebrows rose slightly. "Why?" Michelle glanced around the room, making sure the other customers weren't listening, and then looked back at Paul. "I judged you the moment you walked in here. I saw your clothes and assumed I assumed things that weren't fair, and I didn't give you the kind of service I should have." Paul put down his wallet and gave her his full attention. "You were very polite." "Politeness is not the same as respect," Michelle replied. "I gave you the worst table, the chipped coffee mug, and I barely checked because I figured you wouldn't tip well anyway." She took a deep breath. "That was wrong of me. You've been so kind, and I've been judging you by how you look instead of how you act." Paul was silent for a moment, watching her face. When he spoke, his voice was gentle. "What made
you change your mind?" Michelle looked at Patricia, who was pretending to read the menu but was clearly listening. "Someone told me who you are, but that's not why I'm apologizing. I'm apologizing because it shouldn't matter who you are."
"I should have treated you right anyway." Paul followed her gaze to Patricia and smiled slightly. "Oh, let me guess. Patricia Henderson?" Michelle nodded, surprised. "You know her?" "We met at some charity events. She's a nice person." Paul looked at Michelle. "What's your name?" "Michelle." "Michelle, can I tell you something?" Paul leaned forward slightly. "The best service I've ever received was from people who treated me well before they even knew anything about me. That tells me more about their character than anything else." He gestured around the restaurant. "I come to places like this because I like the food and the atmosphere, but mostly because I like to be treated like a normal person. You did that tonight." Michelle felt tears well up in her eyes. "But I didn't treat you as well as I could have." Paul smiled. "Maybe not, but here you are now, apologizing for something you didn't even need to acknowledge. That says a lot about you." He picked up his wallet again. "Can I ask you something, Michelle?" "Of course. When you decided to become a waitress, was it because you wanted to judge people, or because you wanted to serve them?" The question hit Michelle hard. She remembered her first day at Mel's, how excited she was to work in a place that felt like a community, how she enjoyed making people feel welcomed and cared for. Somewhere along the way, financial pressures and daily frustrations had made her forget that original motivation. "I wanted to serve them," she said calmly. Paul nodded. "I can tell you have good instincts. I've watched how you interact with other customers. You really care about making people happy." He pulled out his credit card. "The world needs more people who understand that service is a matter of dignity, not just money." When Paul handed her the card, Michelle noticed his hands. They were calloused and scarred, the hands of someone who had done manual labor. Even though he was a successful actor, he had not lost the marks of his former life. "Can I ask you something?" she said as she took the card. "Of course." "Those charity events Patricia mentioned, why do you do them? I mean, you could just enjoy your success without worrying about others." Paul was silent for a moment, considering the question. I didn't grow up with much. My mom worked multiple jobs, we moved around a lot, and there were times when a kind gesture from a stranger meant the difference between having hope and giving up. He looked around the restaurant again. I've been incredibly lucky, but I remember what it was like to be invisible, to be ignored because of the way I looked or where I came from. If I can use my success to make sure other people don't feel that way, that seems like the least I can do. Michelle processed the bill, her hands shaking slightly. The total was $24.50. She handed him the receipt to sign, wondering what kind of tip someone like him would leave after the service she had provided. Paul signed the receipt without looking at the amount and handed it back with a smile. "Thanks for dinner, Michelle, and thanks for the conversation." After he left, Michelle looked at the receipt and gasped. Paul had left a $200 tip, more than 8 times the cost of the meal. But it was the note he wrote on the receipt that made her start to cry. "Michelle, thank you for treating me like a person. The world needs more people like you. Keep serving with your heart." Paul and Michelle sank down onto the table where Paul had been sitting, holding the receipt. Patricia silently approached and sat across from her. "He left you a generous tip, didn't he?" Patricia said kindly. Michelle nodded, unable to speak. "That's not why he did it," Patricia continued. "He did it because he saw something in you that was worth encouraging. Paul Walker is one of the few people I know who tips based on character, not service." Michelle looked up, tears still in her eyes. "I almost didn't notice. I almost let my assumptions blind me to who he really was." Patricia reached across the table and patted her hand. "But you didn't let it go. When you needed to, you chose to see clearly. That's what matters." From that day forward, Michelle approached each client with the same openness she had learned from Paul Walker. She realized that everyone who walked through Mel's door had a story, was fighting a battle, was yearning for kindness. Her job was not to judge those stories, but to add a chapter of dignity and care. 3 months later, Michelle received a package with no return address. Inside was a framed photo of Paul with the cast and crew of his latest film, and another note. "Michelle, I heard from Patricia that you've been spreading kindness at Mel's house. That makes me happy. Keep shining. Paul, P.S. The guy in the blue shirt is my stunt coordinator. He grew up in Santa Monica and says Mel's has the best apple pie in town. You never know who might walk through your door." Michelle hung the photo in the back room of the restaurant, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that respect is not earned with wealth or fame, but is freely given to all who deserve dignity, which is to say, everyone. And every time a customer walked into Mel's looking tired, worn out, or disdained by the world, Michelle was reminded of Paul Walker eating meatloaf at table 12, and she chose to serve from the heart, because in the end, that's what separated good service from great service. That's what separated seeing people from actually recognizing them. And that's what turned a simple dinner into a lifelong lesson. The last customer had left. Chairs were stacked on the tables, and Michelle was wiping down the counter when her manager, Tony, approached with an envelope. "This came for you today," he said, handing it over. "Special delivery." Michelle opened the envelope and found a check for $5,000 and a letter written on plain stationery. "Michelle, I hope you don't mind if I get back in touch. Patricia mentioned that you're saving money to go back to school and become a teacher. She also mentioned that you've been taking care of your mother since her surgery. I believe the world needs more teachers who understand that every student has value, regardless of their superficial appearance. Please accept this as an investment in future students who will be fortunate enough to learn from someone who chose compassion over judgment. That night, you reminded me why I love meeting real people in real places. Thank you for being real, Paul." Michelle sat down heavily in the nearest chair, the letter shaking in her hands. Paul Walker had remembered a conversation from months ago, had somehow discovered her dreams and her struggles, and had chosen to help without fanfare or expectation of recognition. That night, as Michelle locked up Mel's diner, she looked at her reflection in the glass door and made a promise. Whether she was serving coffee or teaching children, she would remember that everyone deserves to be seen for who they really are, not who they appear to be. Because sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers, wearing the most ordinary clothes, sitting at the worst table in the house, hoping someone will choose kindness over assumptions. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that choice changes everything.